My name is Chris Mann, and this is my third and last video in a series about the conversation that Sam Harris had with Charles Murray. You can find links to the first two videos in the description box below. In the last video, I showed you that Charles Murray has a habit of speaking as if he doesn't know his opponents have concerns about how information on race and IQ could be used. I also showed that he thinks that either you agree with everything he wrote in the bell curve, or you think average racial differences in IQ are 100% based on environmental factors. At this point in the conversation, they talk about the Flynn effect, which is an effect that he named after Jim Flynn. And this effect describes how the average IQ of all races increase by about 3% percentage points each decade. And this is surprising given that Murray's own research shows that people with lower IQs tend to have more babies. Here, Murray says, the Flynn effect it was noted also by a guy named Richard Lynn, who was one of the people that I'm excoriated with for citing in the bell curve as being an out-and-out racist. But Richard Lynn has also identified this in East Asian tests. It's important to note what Murray is not saying here. He does not define what it means for a person to act like an out-and-out racist. He does not imply that it's morally bad for a person to act like an out-and-out racist. And he does not claim that Richard Lynn acted like an out-and-out racist. All he does is lament that people criticized him for citing Richard Lynn. He goes on to talk about a study that looked into the cause of the Flynn effect, and he said, their conclusion is that the nature of the Flynn effect is pretty much divorced from the nature of the black-white difference. So Murray implies he believes the Flynn effect does not undermine his view that the black-white gap is mostly genetic. Harris counters this and says, that's interesting because I have here a quote from Flynn. He says, an environmental explanation of the racial IQ gap need only posit this, that the average environment for blacks in 1995 matches the quality of the average environment for whites in 1945. I do not find that implausible. Harris then says, so what you just said seems to close the door to that interpretation of the black-white gap. So Jim Flynn himself implied that the black-white gap is mostly environmental based on the fact that the average black IQ in 1995 was where the average white IQ was in 1945. Murray then says, yes it does. And this is a case where I'm citing someone who has done analyses that are at a level of complexity that I am not independently competent to pronounce. So Murray maintains his view that the gap is mostly genetic, based on a complicated scientific study. Now I find this kind of exchange between Harris and Murray to be beside the point. The very existence of the Flynn effect is often used to argue that average IQ differences are mostly environmental. But it could also be the case that so-called safe eugenics is already happening, and that could explain the Flynn effect. Or maybe people with lower IQs tend to die younger for some reason. That could explain it. What causes the Flynn effect is a question for scientific debate, which is different from moral debate. What's the morally good thing to do, even if the black-white gap is mostly genetic? That's the question they ignore here. Harris then turns the conversation back to issues of morality, and he makes a long statement of his views. It all boils down to him saying that treating people as individuals is three things: morally good, strategically good, and logical. He says, You have to treat people as individuals. It's ethically and politically prudent to do this. And here's a crucial point. It's also rational to do this. This statement is similar to, but different from what he said earlier when he implied that treating people as anything other than individuals is morally bad, strategically bad, and illogical. And just like back then, this statement is also a little redundant because if something is strategically good and morally good, it is logical by definition. Harris also seems to project onto Murray by claiming that Murray declared the same view in the bell curve. Now, I haven't read the whole book, so I don't know if this is true, but if Murray did declare this moral view in the book, he must be able to define what it means to treat someone as an individual in such a way that it's scientifically provable. And that definition would have to be better than something like to not make assumptions about someone based on their race or ethnicity, because that's not scientifically provable. After Harris implies it's morally good, strategically good, and logical to treat people as individuals, Murray jumps in and says exactly, and thereby implies that he holds the exact same view. At this point, they've been talking for about an hour, and this is the first time during this interview that Murray implies that something like racism is at least not morally good. This counts as evidence that Harris is not just projecting his own moral views onto Murray, but it's still possible that Murray was trying to agree with only part of what Harris said, the strategic part. And it's also possible that Murray's definition of to treat someone as an individual differs from Harris's. Harris then says, "The truth is, I learned nothing about a person's intelligence simply by being told that he's black or white or Asian. You still need to treat people as individuals. And you make it absolutely clear in your book that given the overlap in these bell curves, there will be many, many blacks who are far more intelligent than most whites." Again, it all comes back down to honestly evaluating individuals. So here, Harris emphasizes that this action is strategically good, given the goal of hiring the smartest people. And then Murray says, "I emphatically agree with everything you just said." This is the first full sentence that Harris allowed time for Murray to say in over a minute. So maybe Murray is implying it's strategically good and morally good to treat someone as an individual, or he's implying it's just strategically good. So this could use some clarification, because after this, Murray goes on to emphasize the strategic aspect of the issue. He says, "Think of it in terms of being an employer. You need a really smart guy for a job, and Barack Obama walks into the interview. Okay, he's black. If you then make inferences about how smart he is based on his membership in an ethnic group, you are going to be making a huge mistake. And the same thing is true not just employers. It's true for admitting people to schools. It is true for all of our interactions with other people." So Murray gives an example using Obama. And he says that if Obama walks in for a job interview and you make assumptions about his IQ based on his race, you are going to be making a huge mistake. So he's implying that it's strategically bad, not that it's morally bad here. He then says, "It's virtually impossible to make that point stick." So he's implying that it's hard to get people to realize that he believes it's strategically bad. All right, so Harris seems to miss this, and he says, "Again, You made that point with absolute clarity in the book. I just read the most controversial sections of the book last night, just to assure myself of this, and you make that point repeatedly. So, Harris says this as if Murray is implying it's both strategically bad and morally bad. But every time in this interview that Murray describes his own views in his own words, he only seems to imply it's strategically bad. So this supports my view that that Harris is projecting his own moral views onto Murray. Here, Murray says, I actually had these hopes that when the book came out, that Dick and I would be applauded for having taken this inflammatory issue and treated it and saying this is not such a big deal. This is nothing to get excited about, but it's something that's better to look at than for people to have these way exaggerated notions of what might be going on. I thought we might get some kudos for that. So Murray says he thought he would be praised for publishing a scientific study on this issue. That implies he believed that other people believed it's morally good for a person to publish a scientific study of race and IQ. This is yet another example of Murray talking as if he doesn't know people have concerns about how this information could be used. Harris responds by saying, it was a kind of moral panic when you look at just how irrational the claims were. So here, Harris uses moral panic with a negative connotation. Earlier, he implied that it's morally bad for a person to participate in a politically correct moral panic. But now he's implying that it's morally bad for a person to participate in any kind of moral panic. So, yeah, he needs to define this term because it sounds like if he had read this book back then, he would not have acted out of concern for how this information could be used. But at least Harris seems to understand why people didn't praise Murray, and at least Harris doesn't praise Murray here for publishing this study. Harris then says, I guess that one thing that must be occurring to our listeners now, and this is my misgiving about having this conversation and going into this area at all. The question is, why talk about any of this? Why seek data on racial difference at all? What's the purpose of doing this? Murray's answer to this question is important. Remember that during the opening remarks at the beginning of the podcast, Harris said that Murray is obviously motivated by an ethical concern about inequality in our society. Harris also said that what happened to Murray, as far as he could tell, had nothing to do with Murray's personal motives for discussing these topics in the first place. That means that the answer that Murray gives to his question, what is the purpose of doing this, was enough to convince Harris completely. Murray's answer begins with, because we now have social policy embedded in employment policy and academic policy, which is based on the premise that everybody's equal above the neck. All groups should be equal above the neck, whether it's men and women or whether it's ethnicities. And when you have that embedded into law, you have a variety of bad things happen. In other words, he wants anti-discrimination measures to be repealed. He then goes back to the example of Obama at an interview. He says, let's go back to the employer who sees Barack Obama walk into the office for a job interview. I'm saying for him to treat Barack Obama as a member of a group as opposed to the man sitting across the desk is idiotic as well as being immoral. So here, Murray implies in his own words that it's illogical and morally bad for a person to not treat someone as an individual. This is the clarification I was looking for earlier, and it means that Harris was not merely projecting his views onto Murray in this case. Murray then goes on to talk about the burden that anti-discrimination measures put on employers. And then here he says, because if you treat all your employees really equally, if you fire them for exactly the same reasons, or refuse to promote them for exactly the same reasons, but those reasons, as all such reasons, don't lend themselves to ironclad proof, you're having to take a chance. When he talks about ironclad proof, he's talking about scientific proof. So he's admitting that it's not possible to scientifically prove that a person is not treating someone as an individual. He's using this as an argument against having anti-discrimination measures. But this simultaneously undermines his argument that it's morally bad to not treat someone as an individual. Unless he can define to not treat someone as an individual in terms of scientifically provable human actions, he'll have to retract his claim that it is morally bad. Here, Murray says, throughout the way that we conduct our economic and educational lives and a lot of other institutions, the equality premise that all groups of people only have differences in outcomes because of racism or sexism or inappropriate institutions, that assumption has created huge harm. So, he implies that false claims of racism and sexism have created huge harms. That implies that he believes it's morally bad for a person to falsely claim someone acted like a racist or a sexist. And that in turn implies that he believes it's possible to scientifically prove that a claim of racism or sexism is false. But he just admitted that such things are not scientifically provable. In what seems like an attempt to prompt Murray to say something more moderate, Harris says, but now to take the flip side of that, whether you acknowledge it now or just in the past, at one point there was a place for affirmative action and other coarse attempts to promote diversity. Do you think that was a mistake from the beginning? Or do you think it's a mistake now, or? Murray responds by basically saying that affirmative action was logical for the first year, but after that, it was promoting minorities and women into positions they were unqualified to hold. Considering that he doesn't have perfect information, this seems like a bold claim. Murray goes on to talk about the old dropout rate of blacks who were let into MIT. He explains the high dropout rate among blacks at MIT by implying that affirmative action lets in blacks who are either not qualified to be there, or they are qualified, but they will consistently be at the bottom of the class and drop out from being demoralized. But won't there always be qualified people at the bottom of the class? Murray is arguing that affirmative action does little good today and should therefore be ended altogether. Not that it should be reformed so that it only helps qualified people. Harris once again reveals that he still has reservations about talking about this topic. He says, but I'm still conflicted over this issue of why study this topic at all, because it's very easy to see why anyone would assume that if you're looking in an area that's producing invidious comparisons between races, and you're continuing to look in that area and continuing to be interested in that area, your interest must be motivated to some degree by a kind of morbid and quasi-racist curiosity. This is interesting because Harris implies there's such a thing as quasi-racist curiosity, while being careful not to imply that he thinks this motivates any scientist at all. He only says he can see why someone else would think a quasi-racist curiosity could motivate a scientist. Harris then acknowledges a concern about how Murray's book is being used by white supremacists, and then asks, why look at this? How does this help society for us to be getting more information about racial difference? The answer that follows must have been so good it completely convinced Harris that Murray is obviously motivated by an ethical concern about inequality in our society. Murray says, "How would I feel if I were a black kid my age going into college and everybody thought I was there because I was an affirmative action kid? I would hate that. I would really hate it. How would I feel if, on the job, I knew that everybody assumed I got that job because of affirmative action? I would hate that, and I would try to do my best to prove them wrong, but I find that morally repugnant. A lot of it was, I think, a kind of empathy. What if I were me, the same way in personality and intellect and everything else and ambitions, but what if I were a black person? But what if I were black living in this world right now?" So Murray answers Harris's question about why he's looking into this area by explaining that he opposes affirmative action partially because of how he imagines he'd feel if he were a qualified black man in college or at a job surrounded by people who assume he is unqualified and he got in just because of affirmative action. So Murray consistently implies that affirmative action only helps unqualified people, and he imagines that the other people at the college or at the job would assume he is unqualified just because an affirmative action program exists at all. Instead of claiming he'd be upset with those people who make assumptions about him and treat him as something other than an individual, he claims he would be upset with people who would openly support affirmative action at all. Murray then says, "When I got to Harvard in the fall of 1961, there were way fewer black students, undergraduates, than there are now. Way fewer. But I will tell you, this was pre-affirmative action, pre-Civil Rights Act of 1964 for that matter. Every time I saw the kid from Newton, Iowa, every time he saw a black face at the student union or whatever, my instinctive reaction was, he's probably smarter than I am. And I made that assumption because I figured the black kids were very likely to have had a tougher road than I had to get there." So here, Murray claims that he assumed that black students were probably smarter than him. And therefore, he seems to admit to not treating them as individuals, depending on what his exact definition of that term is. He also implies that blacks were being held to a higher standard. Keep in mind that he's saying this while explaining why he supports ending all affirmative action programs and anti-discrimination measures. He's supposed to be answering the question of why study this issue in the first place. It sounds, though, like he feels nostalgia for this period. Here, Murray says, "One of the things that just stuck out was the degree to which all these attempts at affirmative action in its new form were creating an atmosphere in which it made it harder for these kids to succeed, not easier." So Murray once again implies that affirmative action only helps unqualified people. Upon hearing all of this, Harris says, "I think your goal, which is a goal that I share, is to find some way for us to get to a truly colorblind society." This means Harris heard everything he needed to hear to be convinced that Murray's research is obviously motivated by an ethical concern about inequality in our society, as opposed to being motivated by a quasi-racist curiosity. So something in Murray's answer cleared up all of Harris's doubts and concerns about Murray. Harris goes on to say, "But I am very convinced at this point that identity politics and maintaining a fascination with racial difference or really any subgroup difference is a dead end morally and politically for us." So Harris implies it's morally bad for a person to participate in identity politics. Murray then says, "You look at our campuses now, and I think it's just incontestable that identity politics have been disastrous on a whole variety of fronts. And I'd say that the identity politics are a direct, straight-line outcome of insisting by law that we treat people as groups." So Murray implies that he agrees that it's morally bad for a person to participate in identity politics. And then he uses this opportunity to claim that affirmative action and anti-discrimination measures are caused by identity politics. So Murray implies that if a person dislikes identity politics, the solution is to openly support ending affirmative action and anti-discrimination measures. Later in the podcast, they talk about what happened when Murray was invited to speak at Middlebury College. He knew there would be protesters, but he thought they would stop protesting eventually and let him speak. Here, he says, "And Middlebury did a couple of things that I've given full credit for. One is they did not disinvite me." So he gives the Middlebury administration credit for not disinviting him, and thereby implies that it is morally bad for a person to openly support disinviting an invited speaker. He then says, "The other thing was that the president of the college was there, and she made a statement beforehand. Now, mind you, her statement was to the effect that we have to let this awful person speak on behalf of the values of freedom of speech. I wish she'd been a little less willing to feed the preconceptions of the crowd." He characterizes what the president of Middlebury College did as feeding their preconceptions. So he implies that it's morally bad for a person to declare someone's actions to be morally bad before letting him or her speak. Harris then says, "This is one of the reasons I was so eager to have you on. I find it so galling that an obviously sober and ethical and well-intentioned scholar such as yourself has to live under this cloud of notoriety, so that every time you're introduced, people have to apologize in advance for the fact that you're even on the stage in the first place. This strikes me as an incredible injustice that academics everywhere should be able to see through immediately, and they should not pander to defamatory misconceptions that have grown up around your work. It's really annoying." This statement is notable because it demonstrates just how convinced Harris was by Murray's previous answer. Harris implies that he agrees that it is morally bad for a person to declare someone's actions to be morally bad before letting him or her speak. As I mentioned in part 1 of this series, this contradicts what he implied on episode 17 of Polite Conversations. Back then, he implied that it's not morally bad for a person to say something like, "It's going to be interesting to talk to this obviously unethical person and see what happens." Now, let's look at some of what the president of Middlebury College actually said before letting Murray speak. Lori Patton said, "Allow me to state the obvious. We are a left-leaning campus." And then, "I would regret it terribly if my presence here today, which is an expression of support I give to all students who are genuinely seeking to engage in a very tough public sphere, is read to be something which it is not, an endorsement of Mr. Murray's research and writings. I will state here that I profoundly disagree with many of Mr. Murray's views." This is what Harris and Murray are implying it's morally bad to declare. She then says, "I'll remind you of the rules. If any person or group of people shuts down the speech of another, they're in violation of the college policy. We state this for a reason. The very premise of free speech on this campus is that the speaker has the right to be heard." When Murray went on stage to give his speech, the protesters in the room stood up, chanted loudly, and didn't stop until Murray left the stage to give his speech in another room. Here, Murray describes what he thought should have been done to those protesters. He basically believes that the ones that could be identified should have been suspended immediately. He's openly supporting punishment, so that implies that he thinks the protesters did something morally bad. And so that implies he believes it's morally bad for a person to protest against an invited speaker in a way that violates the rules of that institution. Here, we see that Harris agrees fully. When Murray left the stage, he went to another room with Professor Stenger to give a summary of his talk and have a debate with her. That debate, by the way, was not that tough for him because Professor Stenger didn't seem to realize what he was and wasn't implying. I may cover that conversation in another video, but in the meantime you can find it here, and I'll put a link in the description box. After their discussion, as Murray and Stenger tried to leave the building, a group of protesters physically assaulted them, and someone pulled Stenger's hair, causing injury to her neck. When Harris brought this incident up, Murray said, "That's a crime. That's criminal prosecution. There should be jail time for the people who injured Professor Stenger." This implies that he believes three things: that this kind of physical assault is morally bad, that it's so morally bad that it should be illegal, and that the legal punishment should include actual jail time. I just want to point out that it's not necessarily the case that someone thinks a morally bad action should be punished with actual jail time. This is how Murray described the incident. "And we opened the door, and there was a crowd of people, and many of them having ski masks on. And it also became clear as we started to walk down that they weren't going to get out of the way. And so we had to push through them, and the security guys were great, but there were only two of them. And so they were having to pull people off us and try to clear a path. And that was when Professor Stenger got injured." Murray implies here that it's not morally bad, or it's morally neutral, for a person to push or pull people in general. So that doesn't count as morally bad physical assault to him. The devil is typically in the details, and getting people on the record about these kinds of details ahead of time is probably strategically good, given the goals of checking for consistency and changing people's minds. Now let's move on to the last part of the interview. Harris asked Murray if he regrets writing the bell curve after all he's been through. Murray says no, and then he says, "Let me put another positive side on it, which is that once you've gone through that kind of experience, it's kind of liberating because they can't say anything new about you. They've done their worst in one sense. And so now I'm working on a book which I'm trying to bring, in many ways, I'm trying to bring a body of literature to a lay audience. And this time it's on the genetics revolution. And I'm free to do this because, will this provoke similar kinds of attacks? I suppose so, because there are too many ways in which genes are getting involved in the issues we are touching on today. But who cares? In so many other ways, I have been freed up in my life to do all sorts of things that I wouldn't have done if I hadn't written the bell curve." Murray is implying that because he was falsely accused of acting like a white supremacist, a white nationalist, a safe or dangerous eugenicist, and so on, he feels freed up to act more like those things. He specifically says his next book will be about the genetics revolution, so he implies he feels freer to act more like a safe or dangerous eugenicist with his next book, and he predicts that he will be called a safe or dangerous eugenicist, but he doesn't care. This implies that he believes it is not morally bad for a person to act more like a safe or dangerous eugenicist. This seems to be in conflict with Harris's implied moral view that it is morally bad for a person to act like a dangerous eugenicist, at least. And yet, Harris didn't seem to notice anything wrong with Murray's statements. If someone falsely accused you of doing something you believe is morally bad, would you then feel freed up to do that action that you think is morally bad? That's a rhetorical question. It's morally bad for a person to act hypocritically. So don't do actions you believe are morally bad, no matter what people accuse you of doing. In response to this foreshadowing about Murray's next book, Harris only says, "Nice. Well, that's a good way to leave it. Despite the blowback I anticipate, I do not regret having this conversation with you." This implies that Harris believes that Murray's statements are still consistent with Murray being a person who is obviously motivated by an ethical concern about inequality in our society. What kind of inequalities can be resolved by acting more like a safe or dangerous eugenicist, though? I suppose it all depends on your definitions of those words, but it seems to me that Murray implied here that he was motivated to act more like a safe or dangerous eugenicist because people were discouraging him from acting like a safe or dangerous eugenicist. That does it for my analysis of the conversation between Harris and Murray. Remember that I treat all their moral views as implied until they are officially and explicitly stated on the record, as demanded by the rules of logical debate.